And we're back, Brittany. So it's a pleasure to see you online. What's the time in the US right now where you're based?
It's 11:30 a.m., so still
Oh,
the
so
morning over here.
it's very early. You just woke up.
Yeah, I had breakfast before this, so thank you
Okay.
guys for staying up until dinner time to wait for me.
Yeah, it is a pleasure. So, Brittany, I pass on the floor over to you. Please go ahead with your presentation, and we will return after that with a quick Q&A. I will use this opportunity to also encourage people viewing us right now to ask their questions that we can voice later on after your presentation. So, please go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. It's a really big pleasure to be here. I really wish I could be with you all in person, but thank you so much for organizing this for me to be able to come in virtually. And I'm really looking forward to being in Lithuania with you next time. So I'm really excited to speak to you all this evening about what I know is one of the most important issues that we are dealing with globally. I call this talk Own Your Data, Lessons Learned from Our Past to Protect Our Digital Future. Because if you haven't seen the headlines yet, a couple of years ago, data became the most valuable asset on Earth, surpassing oil and gas as the world's most important and valued traded commodity or asset. And somehow, all of us as individuals that produce the world's most valuable asset class have mostly no rights to its value. We have spent decades using different forms of technology that have been taking our assets and building some of the world's most valuable companies. Those companies like Facebook and Google, Amazon, these are companies that are so valuable because they hold so much of our personal information. They have been collecting our data since their inception, and that historical and behavioral valuable data is what makes them so incredibly powerful. So over the past few years, there has been a uprising or a movement for data rights and privacy. It was really first in 2013 when Edward Snowden released the allegations about the PRISM project and how governments and militaries and even companies around the world were collecting our personal information, that the world started really to pay attention to what is the meaning of privacy and what policies, legislation, and regulation should we have to protect ourselves. Now, I think over a few years, we got a little bit complacent until the 2016 elections, when we all found out that the amount of data that was being collected about us was being hidden, and the ways in which our data could be bought and sold and traded around the world was not well legislated upon, was not regulated, and we had nearly no transparency into how our personal information could be used or abused, and by whom. So we've obviously started to set that straight over the past few years. And I want to tell you a little bit more about my journey and, why I'm the person that's here talking to you about this. So I really began my involvement in the technology industry in 2007 when I joined the first Obama campaign. I joined a team called New Media, where I think there were just about 5 or 6 of us in May 2007 when I moved back home to Chicago to join the headquarters team. Over the first few months that I was there, we developed what is now known as social media strategy. We were the first team to ever use social media for any form of external communication that wasn't just peer-to-peer. So we developed ways of rudimentarily collecting data in very basic ways, starting with Excel spreadsheets of what we could figure out about each person that we were interacting with. How could we understand which political issues were important to people, whether people would show up to a rally or event, how we could get someone to register to vote for the first time or register to vote again? How could we figure out what drives and motivates people? And I saw very magically that just using a little bit of data was incredibly powerful. It was something where you could encourage, engage with, and motivate people to actually be involved in the political process. You could cure the disease of apathy. You could get people excited and motivated about changing their local area, their cities, their states, their country for the better. And I thought, wow, this is something that I really want to be doing in life. You can see every single day how much you're affecting people and how much good you're doing. So I was very inspired at the intersection of technology and politics and what data-driven platforms could possibly do. I spent many years after that working for charities and nonprofits, United Nations, consulting departments around the world, teaching those organizations how we could use data-driven communications, marketing, campaigning in order to achieve their lofty goals. So whether it was environmental rights or human rights campaigns, if you adopted a data-driven strategy, you could understand exactly how to engage with people, and you could even measure your results. How many people were excited about what you were talking about? How many people cared about the issues that you were campaigning on? I mean, this is very powerful stuff because, as you might know, whether you work in the commercial sector, or you work for the government, everything that you want to be doing should have measurements of effectiveness. You should be able to show exactly how you are communicating with people, how well it's working, and if you are, as they call it in politics sometimes, winning hearts and minds. Are you getting people to engage with your political ideas? Is this working? And all of this is really a question of how much data you have and what types of measurements you're doing while you're running your campaigns. So over many years, I worked for these different organizations around the world, and sometimes I found it was very difficult to show what type of impact you were having. A lot of the communications that you would send out were difficult to actually show if they had reached the individual you were trying to affect or recruit or register to vote. It was very difficult sometimes to be able to prove and show that where a donor's money was going was actually being effective. Or if you're talking about commercial communications, that if you're using advertising dollars, that's actually, translating to sales or a boost in, the worth of a brand, right? So when I was first introduced to Alexander Nix, the CEO of a company you've probably heard of called Cambridge Analytica, and he told me about the types of tools that he was using and the types of data-driven strategies with very clear measurements of effectiveness that they had available in their strategies, in their client work. I thought, well, this is incredibly interesting. When I was introduced to him, I was in the middle of writing my PhD in something called preventive diplomacy. I'm a human rights lawyer by training, so I had spent many years using data in order to quantify the types of impact that we could have to make the world a better place. And fortunately, what you find is that a lot of human rights work is difficult to quantify. And when you are running campaigns or when governments or militaries are trying to implement social policies, it's difficult to actually prove a causal relationship, that you have done something that really has a positive effect on society and you know exactly why that has happened and how you can improve your strategies to really make a bigger impact, right? So I thought, well, I am trying to figure out how I can quantify how governments use data in order to prevent war, in order to prevent violence and conflict. What preventive diplomacy means is that a head of state, president or prime minister, an ambassador, a head of a United Nations department will for instance, make a phone call to another world leader and say, you have crossed a line. We're going to decide to stand up for this. So what makes that person make that phone call in order to prevent conflict with another country? This strategy called preventive diplomacy really all relies upon data. What data is being collected by the government, the military, private companies, on public open databases, on social media? How can that data be collected and analyzed or modeled in a way where you can predict what is going to happen before it does? So whether it's violent conflict or even something like famine, you can use data from all of these sources in order to help prepare and prevent different types of crises and strategy and different types of crises from happening, right? And that was what I was researching. And it seemed that the SCL Group, Strategic Communications Laboratories, which is the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, that they had been helping governments and militaries and companies that were partnered with them understand how to use data-driven tools in order to do precisely that. The first project that the CEO of Cambridge Analytica ever showed me, in fact, was a contract with NATO to train all allied militaries how they could identify young people who were being targeted online for recruitment by terrorist groups. So these young people were vulnerable to being recruited into ISIS at the time, and they were training these different governments and militaries how to run counter-propaganda communications to these young people to keep them safe at home with their families instead of sneaking themselves into Syria. And I thought, wow, this is something really powerful and really special, and I want to learn how to use it. Now, I joined originally while I was still writing my PhD to learn more about data-driven strategies and measurements of effectiveness and how to run these types of campaigns. Now, over the many years I was there, I learned quite a lot more about data than I ever bargained for. What I learned while I was there was quite a few things. It actually blew my mind, the amount of data that is available about individuals all around the world, especially in America. But at the time, I was working on international projects, so countries all around the world, where I could see what data the government had, what open source data was available, what was available on the commercial market. So what was being bought and sold and traded about people without their explicit opt-in or knowledge. This is many years before GDPR came into enactment and before most countries had data protection laws or privacy laws. This is something that's really recent over the past few years. And even the countries that did have data protection laws, they were quite outdated. For instance, our headquarters was in the United Kingdom in London at the time, and the most recent data protection law was from 1998. And I started working at this company in 2014, 2015. So as you can imagine, the legislation that would regulate what we were doing was quite outdated and not really up to par with the types of advanced technologies that were being used at the time. So I was shocked to see the amount of companies that were holding large amounts of personal data, everything from your name and home address, everywhere you've ever lived, all of your location data from everywhere you've ever been, everything you're buying and how much and what brands, where you go with your family on vacation, where you've studied, what you read, what you're searching for, all of your activities, what's going on with everything you're using on your computer and all of the other apps on your phone. It was really, truly shocking and extensive. And even when I first joined the company, Facebook still had what was called the Friends API. So the Friends API was a built for Facebook's developer program. So over 40,000 different companies signed up for access to an API that allowed them to take the data of anyone who opted in using an app or a game, whether they took the Cambridge Analytica "This is your digital life" app that asks you questions like, do you see yourself as a leader in society? Do you believe in the importance of art? Do you get along well with children? Or maybe a quiz, what is your favorite Disney princess? Or what country should you really be living in? Or maybe you played a game like Farmville or Candy Crush. As soon as you opted into this app, you not only gave the developer your data, but you gave access to the data of everyone else in your network. So your mother, your grandmother, your friends, everybody that was in your network's data would also be given to the developer if just you opted in, which of course is not possible under any legislative framework, but it's technically possible, even though the law wouldn't have allowed that at the time. So Cambridge Analytica and tens of thousands of other companies around the world were also using social media as a source of raw data, just like tons of the databases that you could buy from big data vendors like Experian and Infogroup, Axiom, Magellan. And in the US, there's a company even called Labels and Lists, or L2, that sells political data for commercial use. So there's really endless sources of this type of raw data that tells people everything about you. And then there's even online data sources from companies like LiveRamp, Loademe, Rocket Fuel. These are companies that aggregate all of the cookie data for everything that you are doing on your devices. So I don't know if too many people listening to this spend their time reading terms and conditions before you accept cookies on a website that you view. Or maybe I can get a show of hands of how many people have read terms and conditions of any of the apps on your phone? Any of them at all? Yeah, probably not too many hands are going up right now. But what we are doing every time we download a new app, every time we go on a new website that asks us to accept cookies, we are signing a digital contract. I don't think too many people here would accept someone to walk into their office and lay a big pile of paperwork on their desk, all a big pile of contracts. And you wouldn't just flip to the back of every single contract and sign it without reading it. I don't think anyone would ever do that. But that's what you do every single day when you download an app and just click the terms and conditions box. That's what you do when you accept cookies. And there are plenty of companies around the world that have achieved a very high company valuation because they are collecting all of this data that you so willingly give away because you haven't been protected. So then we hit 2016, and we see that in both the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom and the Donald Trump for president campaign, as well as the different political action committees and super PACs that were supporting the Donald Trump campaign, that some of the data that they were getting access to, they were not only getting access to improperly, but they were using it to target citizens in ways that were that couldn't really be considered legitimate in terms of elections. We all of a sudden saw the rise of disinformation and fake news being scattered across the devices that we are using every moment of every day. We all of a sudden saw that foreign countries could have individuals that could go onto platforms like Facebook and use local currency to target political advertising in other countries to incite violence or spur on racial hatred. We saw that some of these campaigns were using voter suppression tactics. Under most electoral laws, you would not be able to, for instance, lie to people about when a voting booth is open or where the voting booth is located. That's more traditional voter suppression, of course. But when you are using digital campaign strategies and data-driven campaign strategies, what you are able to do is untransparently target people with specific data for specific reasons with certain content that would discourage them from participating in the political process. For instance, when you could use data in order to figure out who were vulnerable Hillary voters, who were persuadable to not vote for Donald Trump. They would never vote for Donald Trump, but they were people who maybe haven't voted every year or were not yet registered to vote. And so therefore, if you could send them enough negative content about Hillary, perhaps they wouldn't vote at all. Now, that's obviously a voter suppression strategy, but it's not something that is obvious to the naked eye. Yet we would never have the right at the time to know why we're seeing this content, who's sending it to us, who's paying to put it in front of our eyes, and why. So when concerns started coming out in 2017 and early 2018, I eventually decided to come out as a whistleblower because I realized that most people had no idea about the data industry at all, let alone how extensive it was and how vulnerable we are all as citizens. That there was nearly no protection mechanisms written into laws around the world, and that although we have the human right to our privacy, we didn't actually have the legal or regulatory protections to ensure that that this would be complied with. And even in some places where we did have some laws regulating what was done with data, we didn't even have the technology to ensure compliance, nor the technical capacity to make sure that was happening. So cue me starting to spend all of my time testifying to governments and working with investigative journalists around the world to start to uncover everything that was done with data, not just by Cambridge Analytica and its parent company, but how data was abused on Facebook and other social media platforms, and what could actually be done in order to prevent this from happening again in the future. What should laws and regulations look like? What types of technologies do we need in order to bring transparency and consent and opt-in mechanisms so that we as people can choose what we want our data to be used for? Could we ever harness the value of our data for ourselves instead of it being taken from us in what I like to call a kleptocratic way? These systems have been made to trick us into giving away as many of our digital assets as possible, which basically has made plenty of monopolies, global companies like Facebook and Google, that now control so much of our digital assets that we are powerless to regulate them in many ways. What types of ethical technologies should we be building? And how do we educate a digitally illiterate population? You know, most of us around the world are not what I would call digitally literate or digitally intelligent. We don't understand what our data rights are, basic cybersecurity protocols to protect ourselves. And how do we start to deal with that? So I guess some of you might be thinking, you know, why should we care? Why is this so incredibly important? You know, and it's really because today's issues are the tip of the iceberg. Every single day we are producing exponentially more data than the day before, especially in this time of crisis, this time of coronavirus quarantine, where most of us are now for the first time leading a completely digital life. We are obviously now producing more data than ever before, and more vulnerable populations like children are for the first time having to be on devices all day long without having a full understanding of what that vulnerabilities actually means for them. So there's a lot of work to be done. So I'd like to talk to you now a little bit more about what are some of the high level concepts of digital asset legislation, of data protection and privacy. I obviously started a campaign called Own Your Data. So what that means is that you would own your data like a property. Yes, I believe that we should have rights to our data and rights to our privacy as a fundamental human right. But when we're talking about enforceability, having data as an asset class that we can own like a property actually gives us legal recourse for when our data is abused, such as in a massive data breach like Equifax or the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal. We'd actually be able to protect our property legally and win in court, right? Instead of just seeing a fine being given to a company that, like Facebook, that earns all of that money back in one day because of the rise in their stock prices from all of the press they get. But as you might imagine, for a company like that, all press is good press in a way. So we need to start thinking about enforceability. So something that might help you land the plane about what the concept of data ownership really means. And it's to say you own your personal information like you would any of your other property, like your house or your car. So if you think about the Airbnb model, if you are owning your data like you own your house, then imagine when someone approaches you on Airbnb as what the future of data ownership could look like. If someone wants to use your data, they would tell you who they are, how long they're going to use it for, what they want to use it for, and you would agree on a price before you hand over your keys, like giving someone access to your personal home. And that's really the way that we need to think about what this potential business model could look like and what all of these different initiatives for legislative reform could actually mean. Some other important concepts in data protection are transparency and opt-in. So I should know everything about what data is being collected from me. Right now, if you look at terms and conditions, the reason why you probably haven't is because there is a 46-page tiny type written in legalese by lawyers who are specifically trying to hide from you what they are taking. Right? So even if you have spent the time to read it, you still might not understand what is being collected, where it's going, where is it going to be held, for how long are they going to hold it? Are they ever going to delete it? Are you ever going to have access to that data file on you? Can you opt in and out? Luckily, in Europe, because of GDPR, you do have the option to not opt in. You are not automatically opted in like you are in the United States, but just a couple of years ago, you were. In fact, GDPR only went into enactment on May 25th, 2018. So the day before that, actually sponsored by the government of Lithuania, I was speaking on the opening panel of what was at the time the European Parliament's largest blockchain conference. And we opened the first panel by being asked about GDPR, which was going into enactment the next day. And what I said was, hey, GDPR goes into force tomorrow, and tens of millions of people might request a copy of their data because they now actually have the opportunity to do that. Who here is ready to send them a data file in a secure way? How are you going to send tens of millions of people their personally identifiable information and sensitive data tomorrow if they request it? And the moderator of the panel, who was the former prime minister of Estonia, laughed and said, oh, well, we wouldn't want to attach it to an email. Maybe we'll just fax it to them. And, everybody laughed. But as funny as the joke might have been, the point was that nobody really had a good plan yet. And we were less than 24 hours away from citizens all over Europe being able to request a copy of their data. And there was no real secure system set up for them to be able to receive it. And we've seen over the past many years that the information commissioners are receiving an extraordinary amount of subject access requests. That's what it's called when people request a copy of their data under GDPR that are being sent to companies or government departments, and they're not getting a fast enough response. So that's being kicked over to the information commissioner, and the ICOs are now completely flooded. They have really held their hands up and said, we don't have capacity to answer all of these in a timely manner. So the actual enforcement of GDPR has not brought the type of transparency that we've been hoping for. It's obviously a good step, but it's been very, very difficult to respond. So if we're going to go to the next concept, I want to talk about permission structures and traceability. Whether or not new data protection and privacy laws around the world actually give us the right to have these permission structures, we still don't have too many different technologies that allow for traceability. This is why I have become such a huge advocate for blockchain technology. I mean, it's not the only. I go on for hours about all of the excitement that I have about different forms of distributed ledger technology. But when we're talking about tracking and traceability and the ability to give permission to a company to perhaps use certain parts of your data and not others, or use it for specific purposes and not others. For instance, I might be happy for a brand to try to sell me a new car, but I'm not happy for my data to be shared with political parties, just as an example, right? So I think that the types of permission structures that you can give in a smart contract, for instance, where you have a self-executing contract that says, I opt into this, I don't opt into that, and you can do that instead of just signing or not signing terms and conditions, will in the future be able to give us assurance that our data is being used in the way in which we've permissioned it. So this is really a technology solution as opposed to a legislative solution. Now, my favorite part of the whole data ownership and data rights conversation is this. Now, stay with me here for a minute. The right to monetize your own data. So I really believe that data can become the great equalizer. We are producing the world's most valuable asset every single day, and somehow we are instead just enriching companies to the tune of trillions of dollars of our assets. We are the producers of a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and none of us are seeing real value in return for that. Mark Zuckerberg likes to lie to us and say that our data is only worth $17 a quarter. Our data is worth an exponential amount depending how it's modeled, how it's shared, what we decide to become data inputs into different types of commercial affairs, research, government programs. But Facebook data alone, $17 a quarter would change the lives of a couple billion people that live on under $2 a day. So let's start to think of this in a practical manner. For you and I, it might not make a big difference that we're earning, a couple cents here and there, a couple dollars here and there. But for a big percentage of the planet, it really does. Now we can start to think further past Facebook data. If I use my medical data to become an input into diabetes research, for instance, I could make $28,000 on 6 to 8 weeks of my data if I'm eligible. We have the possibility to become data inputs in a secure, transparent, and responsible way, and be sharing our data with important projects all around the world and be compensated for it monetarily so that we can take care of ourselves and our families. So we need to start thinking in this way. How can we secure data rights and privacy in order to therefore secure our human rights and make our societies and our countries better off? So, when we're talking about privacy versus data science, it might sound weird for you to hear me say that I am not the biggest privacy advocate. In fact, I like the right to privacy because there's always something that you might want to keep to yourself. But I'm more a fan of what I call radical transparency, which would mean that we would encourage people to share as much data as possible, but they could share their data anonymously or pseudonymously. We could securely share our data. We could know exactly where it's going, to whom, for what purposes it's going to be used, and if it will be monetized, again, for purposes that we agreed to, then we could share in the profits of that. So I really think that AI and data science could solve a lot of the world's greatest problems, from stopping mass shootings and terrorism and car accidents to making sure that we can solve diseases faster. Right now, we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and you've probably seen both private companies and governments that are rushing to put out contact tracing apps because we've figured out that it might be possible to stop the spread of the virus if we can find out where somebody has been and who they've contracted it from, and help people who might have been exposed to quarantine themselves and not interact and possibly spread the coronavirus to somebody else. Now, this is something that I would love to be able to feel comfortable with. I would love to be able to encourage people to use technology to help save human life. I think we can all agree to that. But right now, especially in the United States, but now we've seen, protests breaking out across the world, and I support peaceful protesters. I support our right to peaceably assemble. But law enforcement could very easily and has been using contact tracing data, location data, in order to target protesters. And that can become very dangerous. There's many countries around the world that have already used this to abuse and target certain portions of their citizenry. And we need to be very careful about what this means. So over the past few weeks, I have been working with the state of New York to put forth the first bill in the United States that is emergency legislation to protect coronavirus contact tracing data, to make sure that we know where it's going, that we have a limitation for how long it's going to be held, that we have anti-discrimination clauses, a ban on sharing that location data with law enforcement, et cetera, and so forth. There's quite a few different stipulations. It's Senate Bill number 8448, if anyone wants to look into it further. There's also now a federal bill in the U.S. and many other countries that are considering this type of legislation. So if anyone here has the ability to influence policy on that subject, I would highly suggest that both the government of Lithuania and any other countries represented here would consider something similar in order to protect the privacy and the safety of citizens who are obeying the law while peacefully protesting. So there's a lot that we really have to think about. I really want to make sure I leave room for questions. But besides the legislative work that I've been doing, I also started last year something called the Own Your Data Foundation. And what we do is digital literacy training. So we teach people a new curriculum called DQ. Like IQ or EQ, it's a digital intelligence quotient. And that is an indicator set that's been developed over the past 10 years by some of the world's top organizations in tech, from ministries and government departments to top universities and think tanks. And this teaches kids, parents, teachers, first and foremost, but there's also a professional training program, what your data rights are. What are basic cybersecurity protocols to keep your data private or to share it securely? Media literacy to spot fake news and disinformation, hacking and phishing attempts. How to prevent cyberbullying and use emotional intelligence when interacting with other people online. How can you have a healthy relationship with devices and not be addicted to them, and manage your screen time? All of these are in an indicator set that will give you a DQ score, like your IQ score, and a systematic approach for improving that. And I really think that digital literacy is going to help people protect themselves while we're still waiting for legislation and regulation to keep up with technology. But so that's what I'm spending most of my time right now doing. I really think that we we need to have a three-pronged approach, which is legislation and regulation that is much closer, or much more closely representative of how far technology has come. I spend a lot of time putting technologists and legislators together to make sure that technology and legislation actually support each other. We need more ethical technology, which is why I care so much about the development of blockchain and other forms of advanced encryption and tracking and traceability methods and data management solutions. And then, of course, we need the educational piece. We need people to be digitally literate in order to understand how to protect themselves online and lead a successful digital life. So thank you guys so much for listening to my talk, and looking forward to your questions. I know we don't have time for too many right now, but if you want to reach me at all, you can get in touch with me at info@ownyourdata.foundation, or you can tweet at me at ownyourdata.now, and I'd be very happy to be in touch with you guys. Also, for more information on these topics, you can watch my Netflix original documentary, The Great Hack, and read my book, Targeted. Thank you so much.
Brittany, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. It was a pleasure listening to you to speak. As you mentioned, the documentary, I've already seen it. I haven't read the book, but I will encourage everybody to go ahead and look it up and try and read it. I'm sure you'll provide a lot of meaningful insight on data literacy and owning your data and so on and so forth. So a couple of questions. Actually, as a matter of fact, I can say that probably no contest, your presentation was the most sought after, obviously, as I can see on my screen and here on my clipboard, quite a few questions that people want to ask you. So I think we're going to make it into a very interesting and enlightening discussion. So one of the questions that I had to you, so Shoshana Zuboff, I don't know if she coined the term meaningful consent. And when you talked about the agreement to the terms and conditions, right, that according to the British comedian Eddie Izzard was written by a bunch of monkeys because nobody ever read the terms and conditions, right? So
Right.
you can literally dance on the keyboard and people will hit agree in the end. So I'm
Right.
hearing certain fintech startups, at least in Lithuania here, are actually moving towards what they call, I'm not going to use the full word, no BS policy. Because it is really impossible to, first of all, be able to read through pages and pages and pages of legal documentation written by professional lawyers that the company gets protected with. And they took a different approach in the sense that they said, okay, no BS. This is where we're going to use your data. Blah, 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 follow this, this, and that, and this, you're going to know. We're going to use it for marketing purposes as well. But at least they tell you and they come clean on what they're going to do with your data. What do you think about that kind of approach? Do you think it's a better approach than having, well, bunch of thousands of pages of text of legal documentation? What's your take on that?
Absolutely. I think where we're moving is to an area where we're going to start giving people very transparent, easy to understand, opt-in or opt-out solutions. So instead of 46 pages of legalese, you're going to get bullet points that are written in third grade reading level or below, where you get told exactly what is going to be collected from you, who it's going to be shared with, for what purposes, how long they're going to keep it, and you can toggle on or off whether you are happy with that. You might want to share it with certain companies and not others. And then if you decide to toggle all of it off, because you don't want to opt in to all of this data collection and sharing, then you would still be able to use the product. Because obviously most people are still going to opt in to some things, and a lot of people, it's going to take them a while before they even want to look into the terms and conditions, even if they are bullet points. But in the United States, we're at least already getting there. The Federal Trade Commission is saying that the way that terms and conditions are written right now are in contravention of consumer protection standards, because you are coaxing citizens into giving away something that they don't understand they're giving away. So I really think over the next couple of years, we're going to see that change. Even when GDPR came into enactment, you started to see a lot of companies, when you visit their website, that you can either choose to accept cookies or you're given options, and you can open that up and you can understand what those options are, whether or not you want to share something for marketing purposes or political purposes, or whether you want them to keep your data or delete it. So I really think we're starting to get there, and over the next few years, you're going to see a big change.
And I think the point that you mentioned here, that opting out of everything doesn't mean that you will be also opting out of the actual service that you want to use, right? So that was a follow-up that I had, but you already kind of touched upon that already. So I'm going to move on to a next question that I also had. I mean, to a certain extent, and answer truthfully, what do you think? You lobbying in the governmental institutions against tech giants such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, keep on, the list goes on and on, right? Do you think, is it not a little bit of a kind of David versus Goliath type of situation? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I definitely think for a little while it has been a David versus Goliath situation, because these companies are more powerful and more financially stable than a lot of governments. So trying to regulate these corporate giants has been incredibly difficult. The United Kingdom couldn't even get Mark Zuckerberg to show up for testimony. And because GDPR had not yet been enacted when the 2016 data violations happened, and I suppose the collection of data off of Facebook in 2013 and 2014, Facebook was punished under the 1998 Data Protection Act, which capped any fines to the company at £500,000. So that's really difficult to show compliance when you don't actually have the power to wield against a company. And even in the United States, where we managed to give the biggest fine ever at $5 billion to Facebook, they still made that money back because of all the press, which is what I referenced in my talk. So without having real teeth and enforcement in our laws, I think it's going to be very difficult to force corporate giants like Facebook to become more moral and ethical about their commercial practices. So that's why I advocate in all of my legislative work for criminal punishment for contravention of data protection and privacy law. If through gross negligence, like in the case of Facebook and for Equifax as well, you have not been able to protect the citizens' data, there should be a criminal punishment with that. Senator Elizabeth Warren specifically introduced a law last April into Congress called the Corporate Executive Accountability Act, where, again, through negligence, if you allow a data breach, then it is criminal punishment. Incentive to prevent data crimes than a small invoice that an executive can easily pay.
Thank you. And then you already started kind of touching upon Facebook, and I'm very also curious to know what your take on the reputational damage that Facebook kind of inflicted on itself after the 2016 election, and obviously with the kind of slap on the hand, slap on the wrist, and everybody's okay. We continue with whatever was going on, kind of in the same way. The 2019 presidential election is coming up this November. Do you think we are going to see any differences in the way that social media is used for politics? We hear articles in a number of different technology outlets, news outlets, and what have you, that say that some of those companies started kind of self-regulating. Twitter, I think, was in the headlines recently. Google was in the headlines recently as well. What about Facebook? Do you think is going to be more of the same in the 2019 election?
Unfortunately, I have seen that 2020 has become a lot worse, except for Twitter. I mean, what Jack Dorsey has been doing over the past many months is very laudable. Firstly, after Mark Zuckerberg decided to say that he would not moderate what content politicians were putting out, even if it violated community standards that you and I are held to. Then Jack Dorsey said that he was going to ban political advertising altogether, which that's a lot of money to decide to not take. So that was a very upstanding way of him saying we do not have the human and technical capacity to stop fake news and disinformation from intervening in our elections right now. So we are going to take it offline altogether. Fantastic. Also, his willingness to label, all politicians' content as against certain community standards or laws, namely President Donald Trump's recent incitements of violence and disinformation around coronavirus, have been incredibly effective. And I'm sorry that, Mark Zuckerberg has decided not to take the same steps. It's incredibly disappointing and dangerous to our democracies. So I think we have a lot more work to do, and I'm unfortunately terrified at what we're going to see between now and November 3rd.
So effectively, you're saying we're a little bit screwed in terms of our democracy, right? With the lack thereof of any steps from one of the biggest social media platforms nowadays, namely Facebook, right? We can expect to see fairly same scenario that we had in 2016.
Yeah, I would say we're going to still be targeted with fake news and disinformation from both foreign entities as well as domestic. We're still going to have quite a lot of problems with the way that politicians are using data in order to target vulnerable populations with voter suppression tactics. And of course, during the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and issues with race relations in the United States and abroad, we have also seen the usage of social media platforms and digital micro-targeting in order to incite violence, in order to bring further problems in some of the protests. We've seen violent factions that are actually being encouraged with foreign funding, like the white supremacy movement in the United States, where we're actually seeing funding coming from abroad in order for them to infiltrate peaceful protest and to create damaging and violent. So there is both a digital and physical problem coming at the lack of regular social media platforms and of our data itself.
Thanks very much, Brittany. I want to move on to our audience questions as well. I don't want to steal the entire show or your entire time. I hope you still have time to spend a little bit with us, and I want to jump on to the audience questions. Perfect. What can be done on an individual level to own your personal data right now?
So right now, there are a lot of platforms that you can be using to protect your privacy. I would say, for example, you can use Wicker in or soon chat on the blockchain in order to be having actual private encrypted communications. Get off of WhatsApp as soon as you can if that's what you use for your communications. The co-founder of WhatsApp both quit when Mark Zuckerberg started weakening the encryption in order to pull more data from it to monetize with Facebook targeting. One of them even sold their Facebook founder shares and donated $50 million of that to the Signal Foundation and joined their board in order to run for an actual encrypted form. Instead of using Google Chrome, you could be using Brave browser, where you can, earn cryptocurrency for searching on the platform where they collect none of your data and fully protect your privacy. You can use DuckDuckGo, which has been around for a very long time and is a great browser as well. And I would say even start more simply, actually read the terms and conditions of some of the apps that you are using today and decide whether you're comfortable with what you're giving away. Think about who is the company that actually built that app, who are the developers, and are you comfortable with them perhaps taking the data that you are creating in other apps, all of your data from your contacts, your photos and videos, your live location data. Are you okay with that? Because if you're not, you should probably delete those apps and find another way to access the services or convenience that that app has been giving you. Look at your privacy settings. I'm still on Facebook. I just don't have it installed in my phone, because I would say if it's installed in your phone, it's basically spyware. So I would highly recommend that you log into apps where you're not comfortable with the permissions and log into them in a secure browser on your computer and use it that way. So I just log into Facebook every now and then, on Brave browser, DuckDuckGo, and do whatever I need to do. And then I close it back down, always log out of it. But look at your privacy settings in Facebook. Look at it in all of the platforms that you use. Always check out your privacy settings no matter what you're signed into. And if you are not comfortable with how they are, change them or stop using that platform. So start to actively engage with what your privacy means and why you would want to protect certain data. There are steps right now. Over the next couple of years, we're going to see the rise of a lot of, very well encrypted or blockchain-based platforms that are meant to not only help us protect our data and our digital identity, but find safer ways for us to interact in our digital world, and even to monetize our own data. There's a lot of exciting projects coming up. For instance, Rainfall, which will be coming out next year. And that shows us all of the data that we're producing, everywhere that it's held, and how we can monetize it for ourselves in our own digital wallet. There's tons of companies that are developing solutions similar to this. And I really think we're going to see a lot of really exciting and impactful projects come out in this space over the next couple of years.
It's really a good thing that our conversation also is getting recorded and is going to be available for the platform viewers tomorrow, because you have just shared quite a few meaningful ways of actually protecting your own data, and people probably couldn't just kind of, write everything down, but I think this material is very important. So I'll jump on to another question from our audience. What are your thoughts with using blockchain in regards to privacy? Do you have any specific project applications with your company using blockchain?
So I sit on the board of quite a few different blockchain companies, helping advise them on data protection and privacy strategies and what it really looks like to have transparent terms and conditions, and to help people understand what they're opting into and how to protect the data that they're producing in that platform. And I think there's a wide range of different types of blockchain projects that everyone should be keeping their eyes on. And, that's everything from specific digital identity projects, so that you can have your entire digital life, or, your digital avatar, your digital twin, all encapsulated in one application, in one digital wallet. And you can start to see what data there is about you, what data you might need to share with people in order to, for instance, log into a platform where you might use Facebook or Google to log in right now. And then all your data that you produce in that new platform is shared with those companies. Instead, you would fully own your digital identity and be able to own your own private keys and interact in a private or pseudonymous way with different platforms, and share as little data as possible in order to lead your digital life on a daily basis. So there's digital identity projects, and there's data monetization projects. So they will help you earn a living, or a universal earned income, you might want to call it, off of your data. And then the third would be blockchain-based social media platforms. We've seen a huge boom in that. I think the most popular ones out there have been voice.com from Block One, and Chirp out on Links. These are really exciting opportunities for you to engage on social media without giving away all of your personal information and that of your friends and family. So I really hope to see the rise of a lot of these social media competitors as well. So from digital identity to data monetization and new social media competitors, I think the blockchain industry has a lot to look forward to over the coming years.
Thanks very much. I think you touched upon that a little bit. There's a question about data coins as a currency. Do you think that we will get to the stage of actually having data coins?
Well, I mean, all of our coins and tokens that we use in blockchain are just blocks of data already. It's just encrypted blocks of data. So we're already saying that this data is so valuable once it's encrypted that we are ascribing an enormous amount of value to it. So all of the cryptocurrencies that we're using, all the different asset classes of digital assets, from utility tokens to digital securities, we are saying that data is very valuable. Data holds value. So when we're starting to ascribe data different value points, obviously it depends what that data is, what it's going to be used for, whether it is a security or utility or even a membership token, whatever it happens to be, we are saying that it is valuable and there is a value exchange for that encrypted block of data. So when we're trying to monetize our personal information, I don't see anything different than the way that we are monetizing, Bitcoin or Litecoin or EOS or Bitcoin Cash, whatever it happens to be. We're talking about data, and how that data was created and how it's valued depends on what it is going to be used for. So as I said in my talk, whether my Facebook data is worth $17 a quarter, or whether my healthcare data is worth $28,000 in an 8-week diabetes study, it depends what it's going to be used for and who can make use of those data points. And that's why I think a lot of platforms that are helping us monetize our data and helping add value to the raw data sets by modeling it for commercial, political, defense purposes, whatever it happens to be, that we're going to really see the data marketplace and the ability for us to actually have a universal earned income coming into our wallet every day in tokenized form as a real possibility.
Brittany, thank you very much. I have one more question that I'd like to ask. I think a lot of us actually came to a similar conclusion post the recent issues with data being misused and all of the news kind of news articles that showed up with regards to the misuse of personal data. The kind of immediate response to that from a person that doesn't necessarily have all the literacy is, should I limit my use of the social media platform because less activity I do on the platform means less data for the company, and that way I kind of punish them and they don't know as much about me and therefore cannot micro-target me or push in ads or what have you. Do you think this is a meaningful way of actually protesting against social media companies?
Absolutely. The less time that you spend in a platform, the less data you are giving them. It doesn't obviously stop them from being able to buy data about you from your banks and credit card companies and all the other apps that you might be using and all of the big data vendors that are collecting your online activity. But if you start to take your privacy seriously and produce less data in general for them to buy, then yes. And within the platform is the most valuable data for them because they're the only ones that hold it. So it definitely makes you less vulnerable to micro-targeting, especially if you spend less time in the platform, because that's less time looking at those ads. I really encourage everybody to take seriously management of your screen time. A lot of phones these days actually show you how much time you spend on your screen on a day-to-day basis. I know we're not able to go and hang out with each other so much right now due to quarantine measures in order to protect human life, and we have to lead more of a fully digital life. But please spend less time on your screens than you think you want to. We don't want to come out of this coronavirus epidemic where we're more addicted to our devices than before we went in. That makes us more vulnerable to targeting. It creates more data for companies that is not yet regulated, that we can't track and trace where it's going. So I would absolutely say that all measures that you can take to limit the data that you're creating for companies that have not shown to take our data privacy and data protection seriously, the better.
Thank you very much for the answer. And ladies and gentlemen, Brittany Kaiser, please watch The Great Hack on Netflix. Read her book, Targeted. Brittany, it was a pleasure having a conversation with you today. I'm sure you have a very productive and busy day ahead of you, whilst we have the closing remarks to do for the event today, as we have another 3 days coming up. So thank you very much for your time today. It was a pleasure talking to you.